For the thousands in attendance and the millions at home watching on YouTube, let's get ready to talk about old video games. Okay, I'm sorry, that was quite silly. But it felt good. Michael Buffer's a legend. Anyway, in today's episode, I'm back to looking at a sports game, but it's the first game featuring the sweet science of boxing that I've looked at. There's not a ton of boxing games for the 8 and 16-bit Sega platforms, but there are a few. And of those few, definitely some memorable titles. And coincidentally, this video is going up the weekend of the huge Deontay Wilder-Tyson Fury match, which works out well. I like when I can thematically match the game I'm reviewing with something that's going on in the world. Like that Wilder-Fury fight, James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing references a bit of a bygone era these days. In the 80s and early 90s, the heavyweight division was king in boxing. Everyone wanted to see the biggest, baddest dudes beat the ever-loving crap out of one another. And as physically imposing as the stars were, their personalities shone through as well, making for characters you really wanted to see mix it up on the biggest stage. In the last 20 years or so, the heavyweight division lost a bit of its luster. Many have blamed the Klitschko brothers for that, due to the fact that they didn't tend to lose, refused to fight one another, and their Eastern European sensibilities simply didn't translate to Western audiences giving a crap. Instead, the focus of professional boxing moved to the lower weight classes, not to mention a lot of the more bloodthirsty audiences transitioning to UFC-style fights. But in the Master System and Genesis era, the heavyweights were king. And none so more than Iron Mike Tyson, a man of pure pugilistic destruction that seemed born to destroy anyone put in front of him. Until a fateful night on February 11th, 1990, in Tokyo, Japan, that is, when Tyson went up against James Buster Douglas, a 42-1 underdog who was just supposed to be a tune-up for an eventual matchup with Evander Holyfield. Well, no one told Douglas that, and all of a sudden the heavyweight division had been knocked on its ear, literally. Previous to all these shenanigans, two things had occurred. Nintendo famously ported their successful arcade machine Punch-Out to their NES, and decided to add the previously mentioned Mike Tyson to the proceedings, adding his name to the marquee and putting Mike in the game as the final boss. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out was a huge hit for the NES, and one of the more notable NES releases of the late 80s. At the same time, Taito had released a completely different arcade boxing title called Final Blow. Final Blow, rather than being a vertical boxing game like Punch-Out, was instead a horizontal title that featured huge animated fighters mixing it up on the screen. Taito had ported Final Blow to a few home consoles and computers, but after Buster Douglas' big upset of Nintendo icon Mike Tyson, Sega stepped into development of the American and European versions of Final Blow and worked with Taito to include Douglas in the game instead, becoming another in the line of big-name Genesis sports games with real people in the titles, similar to Joe Montana and Pat Riley, whose games we previously looked at in episodes 27 and 37, respectively. Sega's bragging rights of Buster Douglas versus Mike Tyson wouldn't last long, due to Buster Douglas having a championship reign that was eerily similar to the quality of this game, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's take a look at the game.
Okay, for any of you that saw last week's video about Lethal Enforcers, the physical section of the review this week isn't going to last anywhere near as long. There's simply not that much to discuss here. As you can see, this is an earlier Genesis cover, but as it was released in 1990, it progressed to the newer style that featured the cover art inset in a box, see out here, rather than going all the way to the edges like the PAL release. The PAL cover uses the same picture, but cropped slightly different, and I think this does look better between the two. I'm not sure if this picture is from the famed Tyson fight or not, but I've got to be honest, Buster is looking a bit doughy here. I can see why he was such a big underdog. At the bottom, there's a script-style signature of his name that somewhat obscures the knockout portion of the title. And honestly, before doing this review, I'd forgotten that knockout was a part of the title. Having his nickname as a part of the game's title already lengthens it a bit, and adding knockout in there just makes the whole thing a mouthful. Probably should have followed the less is more theory there. The boxing cover's in good shape all around, as you can see, with the exception of having the circumcised hang tab. I'll never understand why so many of these cases have their hang tabs removed. I can only assume there was some sort of case or shelf that the previous owners were trying to store the games in, and they just needed those tabs gone for them to fit properly, but it's a shame. Other than that, though, no obvious tears or scratches to the outer cover, and the inner cover looks great with no excessive corner wear or sun damage. Flipping over to the back, there's a few paragraphs of flavor text and 3 good-looking screenshots, and all cropped in a way to resemble the rounded faces of CRT screens. All 3, even the smaller 2, look great. And they're exactly what screenshots of this era should look like. And you can see from the screenshot at the top what was selling this game, and that's the graphics. It just looks really great. Just look how awesome and huge those characters look. At the top, right up here, there is a nice bit that I like that continues the needling of Nintendo. Pummel your way to the title in a game designed with all the toughness of James Buster Douglas, the Columbus, Ohio boxer who beat Mike Tyson. Yeah, just had to throw that in there, and legally they could because it's a fact. Down at the bottom, you can see how this was actually a Taito game. Even though Sega owns the copyright to this renamed version, it really is a Taito title. I just find that you have no way of distinguishing the fact that it's technically a third-party title in this release, and it looks like just any other Sega first-party game. Opening the box up, and we've got the cartridge and manual. Cartridge being in really good shape there. And the manual isn't perfect. As you can see, there's some curling on the edge there. But it's in pretty good shape, and I've certainly seen worse. The manual isn't very big. You can kind of see there how thin it is. But that's to be expected, as this is an arcade title, and it's just simply not a very complex game. More on that in a bit. There's a nice section toward the middle that I've got this opened up here too, with pictures and stats of each of the 5 boxers you can select. And of course, Buster gets his own page. And then at the end, there is a classic Sega scorebook high score page for entering in your scores. But other than that, there's not much noteworthy here. Okay, well, there's our physical inspection of the game. Let's get to the actual review and see just how well James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing translates Final Blow to the home. Final Blow was such a better name. The main selling point of the Genesis/Mega Drive when it was first released was that it had enough power to really bring 16-bit arcade quality games home. Previously, the NES, and to a lesser extent the Master System, just simply didn't have the guts to really translate the most recent, flashy arcade titles without them being cut down to severe lengths, where depending on the game, they barely resembled the actual arcade title any longer. A good example of this would be Double Dragon, which received a game that only vaguely resembled the arcade original on the NES, and more of a valiant effort on the Master System. But if I'm being honest, even that port wasn't nearly as impressive as an arcade cap. There's a lot of things that your average 16-bit console can handle that your 8-bit can't. Hence the Sega marketing line, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. 16-bit systems tend to have better color utilization, better audio options, and the ability to handle more sprites on screen without slowdown or flickering. And finally, the ability to have larger sprites. The ability to have larger sprites is where Final Blow really made its mark in the arcades, with boxers that take up literally a quarter of the screen each. Later on, SNK titles like Art of Fighting and Samurai Showdown would have similar large characters on screen during zoomed-in segments, but in 1988, this was pretty unique to Final Blow. So, having said all that, how does the Genesis version hold up to the arcade original? Especially in light of how impressive the title was at the time graphically in the arcades. Graphically speaking, pretty damn well. When comparing the arcade version of Final Blow to James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing, there's two things that stand out to me. The arcade version has lots of frames of animation to go with the almost excessively large boxers, and it has lots of very clear speech to introduce the boxers at the beginning of fights. The fighters in the Genesis version are just as large, so the scope of the boxers and the ring itself hasn't changed at all. The animations, however, have been downgraded a bit, but aren't bad. If anything, the animations in the arcade version are almost a bit too smooth. And with that, I'm running out of good things to say about this game. The announcer that would introduce the fighters at the beginning of each round? Gone. Not just replaced with a crappy version of the announcer that sounds rough, or that doesn't say as many words, just totally removed from the game. Honestly, with as cool as the graphics are in game for 1990, it seems like that was the only focus of the design team, as the game's sound system is absolutely abysmal. With the exception of the game's main theme song, which also plays when the game is paused, I might add, if you want to hear a little bit more of it, there's just not much here sonically, as the rest of the soundtrack sounds positively 8-bit. As far as the in-game sound effects go, they're just bad. Well, I take that back. There's exactly one good sound effect, the ring bell. Other than that, I'm not sure what they were thinking. The crowd noise, something that's usually just represented by white noise at bare minimum, instead uses something that I can only describe as a laser shot. And while crowd noise is pretty important in any sports game, much less one where the crowd is the entire background for the game, there's one more important type of sound effect in a boxing game, and that's the punches. Do the punches sound like punches? Maybe some nondescript thuds of glove coming in contact with muscle, or perhaps the slap of leather against skin? No, not even close. The sound effects for punches have a sample assigned to them that I can only describe as a sound effect used in a platformer when your character strikes steel and bounces off. Now, I've heard especially chiseled boxers described as having bodies made of steel, even to the point of the aforementioned Mike Tyson having the nickname of Iron, but this is ridiculous. It almost sounds like there was a critical rush to bring the game to market by a certain date, and in doing so, sound effects that have been reused from other sources and just been placed in the game to serve as placeholders until the final official sound effects were ready to go, were instead used as the final effects to get the game shipped out the door. That's probably more conspiracy theory than anything else, but pay attention to the sound effects used in this video and tell me if you think they're appropriate for a 16-bit boxing title. I think you'll agree that they don't fit the game at all. As the game was originally a two-player arcade game, the home version retains that same functionality, and can be played in either one-player mode in a journey to win the title, and then defend it against all the same boxers in rematches before finally taking on a secret final boxer, or players can choose between each of the 5 main boxers and go at each other in a one-on-one bout. Finally, there's also an additional spectator mode, where you can watch any of the 2 of the 5 main boxers take each other on. I don't really see much point to this mode, but I guess it's nice to have as an additional option. In the single-player mode, you can choose one of 5 boxers to proceed through the game and attempt to win and defend the heavyweight championship. And an interesting twist, unlike Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, Buster Douglas is not the final boss, and instead he's one of the 5 boxers that can be chosen to play as. His character replaces the Detroit Kid from the original Final Blow. Oddly enough, for a game released in 1990, the game is incredibly racially diverse, with only 2 of the boxers being black, and also including a white boxer, a Latino boxer, and an Asian boxer. In playing the game, I wasn't able to really determine any difference between the fighters, other than just what they looked like. However, I did find it interesting that apparently Taito originally designed the game to feature cruiserweights, not heavyweights. While this distinction is probably lost on anyone that's not a boxing fan, if you check the weights of all the boxers, only 2 are above 200 pounds. King Jason, just barely at 200.5 pounds, and Buster Douglas at 231.5 pounds, an average of about 35 pounds heavier than the other four fighters. Now, I know the Detroit Kid's weight was probably more in line with the other four fighters, and when Buster Douglas was shoehorned into the game, they just updated his stats to match up with his real-life stats, but they really should have updated everyone's stats to match. It's technically totally meaningless since all the fighters seem to be the same, but that lack of care mirrors the weak attempt at in-game sound. Playing the game is not great. I understand it was originally an arcade game, which makes it right for button mashing, and I certainly didn't expect an in-depth boxing simulation here, but to say the game isn't very deep is a huge understatement. The trite phrase, "beauty is only skin deep," is very apropos here, as the game gets very ugly very quick. Of the Genesis 3 buttons, the A button is used for jabbing, the B button is used for straight shots, and the C button is used to duck? Yes, duck. This is because pressing up and down on the D-pad is used for either selecting head punches in defense or body punches in defense. Also, if you spend the fight just pressing A or B, you'll never do enough damage to the other fighter to knock them down. Instead, you have to press the A button and the B button together to instead attempt a power punch, which changes depending on if you combine it with pressing up or down on the D-pad, with the drawback being that the power punch is slower and easier for the computer to block. In the end, no matter which of the three difficulty levels you choose, the game turns into Rock'em Sock'em Robots very quickly, at least until you end up at the final fight against a non-selectable hidden character, at which point you can pretty much throw everything out the window and just pray you can slowly whittle his health down before your character gets TKO'd. Now, I don't mind Rock'em Sock'em Robots. I think it's a fine, silly kids game. But as a video game, in a scenario that's purporting to be more than just hitting buttons and getting lucky if one lands, it's an utter failure. My second time playing the game, I accidentally put the game into hard mode instead of easy, and I still made it all the way to the final hidden boss, with very little change in actual gameplay. Yes, your power punches don't do quite as much damage the hard level you choose, but the actual process of getting that last boss, it doesn't change at all. Begging the question, why even have the difficulty levels to begin with? Because the final boss is nigh on invincible regardless, and if you're good enough to beat him in easy, you can probably beat him in hard as well. In the end, James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing's quality is synonymous with Buster Douglas' real-life championship reign, as he only held the belt until his next fight, which found Douglas staring up at the lights after only 2.5 rounds with Evander Holyfield. As such, I'm giving this game only 1 out of 5 stars. That might seem a bit harsh, especially with as good as the game was graphically at that time in 1990, but from a playability perspective, it's simply not much fun and has almost zero depth. To be able to almost beat the game the second time I played it, in hard no less, only to get stopped by a final boss that's almost impossible to beat in any difficulty level is pretty awful. This is one of those games that back in the day you would get from Blockbuster or some other rental place, and be pissed off that you wasted a rental on it because after an hour or two, you'd seen all there was to see. While the game is mildly interesting from a historical perspective, I wouldn't be surprised if by the time I get done reviewing all the Genesis boxing titles, this one's near the bottom, if not all the way in the basement.
And that was James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing. I've got to say, without spoiling anything, that as disappointing as the Wilder Fury fight was, it was better than this, but not by much. You know, sometimes I go back and play some of these titles that I've known about for 30 years but never played, and after playing them I get a nice sense of satisfaction and pleasure that I finally get to experience that title. And then there's games like this, where I guess the best thing you can say about it is that I got closure? Anyway, tune in next week when we go back to the Master System and take a look at another European exclusive. And considering Europe has got about 150 Master System titles that the US didn't, there's definitely a lot of those for me to make my way through. I think I'll go with a licensed movie title, because, hey, I hate myself. Let's do 2 bad games in a row. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.